The gunshot shattered the quiet of Maple Ridge just before dawn, echoing across the empty parking lot of a 24-hour gas station on Route 17, and Daniel Harper stood frozen beside pump number 3, with the gasoline nozzle still in his hand, as the body collapsed near the entrance doors. For half a second he didn't move. His brain refused to process what his eyes were telling him. The man who had just stumbled out of the convenience store, blood spreading through the front of his denim jacket, hit the pavement hard enough that Daniel heard the impact even over the buzzing fluorescent lights above the Claas pumps. The smell of gasoline suddenly felt too strong. Somewhere behind the counter inside the store, a woman screamed. Daniel slowly lowered the nozzle back into the pump cradle, his heart thudding so violently he could feel it in his throat. The man on the ground tried to crawl. He dragged himself a few inches across the concrete, leaving a thick smear of blood. Daniel's first instinct was to get in his truck and leave. That instinct terrified him more than the gunshot. He forced his legs to move instead, stepping toward the fallen stranger. The automatic doors slid open behind the body, and a young clerk rushed outside, holding a phone and shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Oh my God, sir, can you hear me?" she cried. The wounded man rolled slightly onto his side. His eyes locked onto Daniel. They were wide and desperate. The eyes of someone who understood time had suddenly become very short. His mouth opened, but the words came out, broken through blood. They said not to trust." His voice dissolved into a cough. Daniel crouched beside him without thinking. "Don't move. Ambulance is coming," he said, though he had no idea if that was true. The clerk was still babbling into the phone. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The dying man grabbed Daniel's jacket sleeve with shocking strength. "Locker, courthouse, tell Maggie." His grip weakened before the sentence finished. His eyes rolled slightly toward the sky. Daniel watched the life drain out of them in real time. A strange silence followed, as if the whole town had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Then, tires screeched across the lot. Daniel looked up. A black SUV sat idling near the edge of the gas station property, half hidden in the shadow of a broken streetlight. The driver's window was down. Daniel couldn't see the face inside, only the dark outline of someone watching. The engine revved once. Then the SUV sped away onto Route 17. The clerk kept talking to the dispatcher through tears. "He's not breathing. I think he's not breathing." Daniel slowly stood, staring after the vehicle as it vanished into the empty highway. His hands were shaking now. He wiped them on his jeans and realized they were covered in blood that wasn't his. 15 minutes later, red and blue lights flooded the parking lot. Sheriff deputies from Maple County swarmed the scene. Daniel sat on the curb with a blanket around his shoulders, even though the morning air wasn't cold. A deputy with a tired face and coffee breath stood in front of him, holding a small notebook. "You're the one who was closest to the victim," the deputy said. Daniel nodded. "Name? Daniel Harper. Address?" Daniel answered automatically. He had lived in Maple Ridge his entire life. Population just under 8,000. One high school, 2 churches, 3 bars, and a courthouse that had stood on Main Street since 1911. The deputy scribbled something. "Did you see who shot him?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I heard the shot. He was already coming out of the store." "You see a vehicle leave?" Daniel hesitated. The image of the black SUV flashed in his mind. Something about it felt wrong. Not just suspicious. Intentional. Watching. Waiting. But another instinct rose alongside that thought. Trouble. Maple Ridge was a town where people survived by avoiding trouble. "No," Daniel said finally. The deputy studied his face for a moment, then wrote something else. "All right. If you remember anything else, you call the sheriff's office." Daniel nodded again. The body was already zipped into a black bag. The clerk sat inside the store with another officer, still crying. Dawn was starting to color the sky pale gray. Daniel walked back to his pickup truck, feeling like the ground had shifted under his feet. As he climbed into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed. A text message from his younger sister appeared on the screen. "Maggie, are you still coming to Mom's appointment today?" He stared at the message. The dying man's words echoed again in his head. "Tell Maggie." Daniel's stomach tightened. The coincidence felt wrong. He typed back quickly. "Daniel, yeah. I'll be there. Driving home now." But the moment he started the truck, he knew he wasn't going home. Instead, he drove straight toward Main Street, where the old courthouse stood at the center of town like a stubborn relic. Maple Ridge was waking up slowly as he rolled past the diner and the feed supply store. People here believed they knew everything about their neighbors. Daniel had always believed that too, until 30 minutes ago. He parked across the street from the courthouse and sat there watching the empty stone building. The man had said something about a locker. Daniel had no idea what that meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something bigger than a random shooting. The courthouse doors opened. Sheriff Tom Calder stepped outside with a cup of coffee. He was a broad man in his late 50s with a permanent sunburn and the easy confidence of someone who had run Maple County law enforcement for almost 2 decades. Daniel had known him since childhood. Calder spotted Daniel's truck and lifted the coffee cup in casual greeting. Daniel raised a hand back automatically. A strange thought slid into his mind then. If the dying man had really meant the courthouse, why? And why had he said Maggie's name? Daniel looked at his phone again. Maggie worked 2 blocks away at the county records office. Suddenly, the town he had known his whole life felt full of locked doors he had never noticed before. He stepped out of the truck and crossed the street toward the courthouse entrance. Sheriff Calder watched him approach with mild curiosity. "Morning, Danny," Calder said. "Heard you were at the gas station shooting." "Yeah," Daniel replied. "Rough morning." Calder took a sip of coffee. "Town like this doesn't see much of that. Folks are already talking about it." Daniel studied the sheriff's expression. Friendly. Relaxed. Exactly the way it had always been. But Daniel's nerves were humming now. "Did they identify the guy yet?" Daniel asked. Calder shrugged. "No ID on him. Probably a drifter passing through." Daniel nodded slowly, though something inside him rejected that explanation immediately. The man had said, "Courthouse." He had said Maggie. Drifters didn't usually know the names of people in county records offices. "Listen," Daniel said carefully. "I actually came here to see my sister. She's already inside?" Calder nodded toward the side entrance. "Records office opened early today. Property tax season." Daniel forced a casual smile. "Right. Thanks." As Daniel walked past the sheriff and pushed through the courthouse doors, he felt Calder's eyes linger on his back just a little longer than normal. Inside, the building smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Fluorescent lights hummed above the tiled hallway. The records office sat at the end of the corridor. Daniel could hear Maggie's voice before he reached the doorway. She was laughing with someone. That sound eased his chest for a moment. Maggie Harper had always been the stable one in their family. Responsible, organized, the opposite of Daniel's drifting construction jobs and half-finished plans. She looked up from behind the counter as he stepped inside. Her smile widened immediately. "Danny, I thought you were coming later." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught when he noticed something on the counter beside her. A small metal key attached to a plastic tag. The tag read, "Locker B17." And Maggie was holding it like she had been expecting someone to come ask for it. The room suddenly felt colder. Maggie noticed his expression. "What?" she asked. Daniel looked at the key again. The dying man's voice echoed in his memory. "Locker. Courthouse. Tell Maggie." Daniel slowly asked the question. He suddenly wasn't sure he wanted answered. Where did that key come from? Maggie's smile faded slightly. "It came in the mail this morning. No return address." "Why?" Daniel felt the weight of something invisible settle over the room like a storm cloud forming. "Because someone just died telling me you had it." Maggie stared at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Maggie whispered quietly, "Danny, what are you talking about?" Daniel realized then that whatever had started at that gas station was no longer just a shooting. It was a door opening into something Maple Ridge had probably been hiding for a very long time. And now he and Maggie were standing right in the doorway. Maggie set the key down so carefully, it almost looked like she was afraid it might explode. "Danny, start over," she said. Her voice was low now, stripped of its usual easy warmth. "Who died?" Daniel looked past her toward the open office door, making sure nobody was close enough to hear. A clerk in the adjoining room was wrestling with a jammed copier. Somewhere down the hall, a judge's secretary laughed at something on speakerphone. The county courthouse was moving through its normal morning, and that normalcy made the conversation feel even stranger. "A man at the Route 17 gas station," Daniel said. "Shot in the chest. He came out bleeding. He looked right at me. Said, 'Locker, courthouse, tell Maggie.' Then he died." Maggie's face lost color a little at a time, as if somebody were slowly draining it. "He said my name?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "And that key came in the mail this morning?" "About 20 minutes before you got here." She picked it up again, this time turning it over in her fingers. "No note, just the key in a plain envelope. I thought maybe it was some kind of county storage key somebody mailed by mistake." Daniel leaned in. "What locker is B17? Maggie shook her head. "Not ours. Not for public records. Basement, maybe. There used to be old evidence storage downstairs before they renovated." Daniel glanced toward the hall. "Can you leave for 5 minutes? I'm working. Maggie." His voice came out sharper than he intended. She flinched, then looked at him the way she used to when they were kids, and he'd come home with blood on his lip from some fight he swore he hadn't started. "You're scaring me," she said. Daniel exhaled hard. "Good. Maybe that means you'll come downstairs." Maggie slipped the key into her cardigan pocket and told the copier clerk she'd be back in 10 minutes. They walked through the back corridor together without speaking. The basement stairwell door groaned when Daniel pulled it open. Cool, stale air rose up from below, carrying the smell of concrete, mildew, and old paper. The courthouse basement had always felt like the part of town memory forgot, full of outdated files, broken furniture, and things nobody wanted but nobody threw out. Their footsteps echoed as they descended. Maggie hugged her arms around herself. "I don't like this," she said. "I know. You didn't tell the deputies what he said?" Daniel thought of the black SUV, thought of Sheriff Calder outside with his coffee, casual as ever. "No." "Why not?" He didn't answer right away. They reached the basement landing. One fluorescent tube flickered at the far end of the hall, turning the corridor into alternating bands of sickly light and shadow. "Because I got a bad feeling," he said finally. Maggie gave a short, humorless laugh. "That is not an answer. It's the only one I've got." They moved past old records shelves and dented filing cabinets until they found a row of rusted metal lockers against the far wall. Most had no numbers anymore. A few hung open, empty except for dust and one abandoned work boot. Near the end of the row, Daniel saw a brass plate stamped B17. Maggie took the key out with trembling fingers. "This is insane," she whispered. Daniel stood beside her and listened. Somewhere above them, the courthouse thumped with life. Down here it sounded distant, like rain on another roof. Maggie slid the key into the lock. It stuck halfway. She cursed under her breath, jiggled it, then turned harder. The latch clicked. Daniel opened the locker door. Inside sat a thick manila envelope, a cheap disposable cell phone, and a small digital recorder. Nothing else. Maggie stared. Daniel reached for the envelope first. On the front, written in black marker, were 3 words: "For Maggie Harper." "Jesus," Maggie said. Daniel looked at her. "You know anything about this?" She shook her head too quickly. "No." He held her gaze. "You sure?" She swallowed. "Danny, I swear to God, I don't know what this is." He believed that she didn't know the whole of it. He wasn't sure anymore whether she knew a piece. He opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies of county land transfer records, bank statements, and a handful of printed emails. Maggie took one sheet from him and stared at the header. "These are county property records," she said. "Old ones." Daniel leafed through the stack. Most of the parcels were on the west edge of Maple Ridge near the river, where old warehouses and abandoned grain lots had sat empty for years. But the names attached to the transfers didn't make sense. Parcels had been bought and sold repeatedly between shell companies, with patriotic names like Liberty Basin Holdings and American South Redevelopment. Then one line jumped out at him. "Final beneficiary authorization, Calder Development Group." He looked up sharply. "Calder," he said. Maggie went still. "Sheriff Calder?" Daniel handed her the page. Her lips parted. "He doesn't have a development company." "Looks like he does." Maggie kept reading. "These signatures are wrong." "What?" "Not wrong like fake signatures. Wrong like filing sequence. These deeds should have required public board review. There should be attachments, zoning notices, tax board minutes. I'd have seen some of this." Daniel took the digital recorder and pressed play. Static hissed. Then a man's voice came through, tense and breathless. "My name is Edward Rains. If you're hearing this, I'm probably dead or close to it. I worked as an accountant for Midstate Community Bank in Maple Ridge. 3 years ago, I started seeing transfers tied to county land purchases and emergency maintenance appropriations. Small numbers at first, then larger. Federal grant money moved through local infrastructure accounts and out into private holding companies. I went to Sheriff Thomas Calder because he chaired the County Emergency Oversight Board. Biggest mistake of my life." Daniel and Maggie exchanged a look. The recorder crackled. Rains continued. "The money was being washed through demolition contracts, storm repair contracts, opioid settlement support funds, and church charity reimbursements. That's how they hid it. People trust words like recovery, charity, redevelopment. I kept copies. Once Calder knew I was looking, people started following me. I sent one package to Maggie Harper at County Records because her name kept coming up as the last clean signature point on several filings. If she hasn't been compromised, she may still be able to prove the chain." Maggie stepped back, as if the words had struck her physically. "Compromised?" she repeated. Daniel took the recorder from her and listened as the voice kept going. "If they pressure you, look at the Whitmore Tract, Parcel 14C, and the Old Street Luke's Shelter Annex. Those are the pivot points. Trust nobody in county law, not even deputies, especially not Calder. There is another ledger. I don't know where they moved it. Ask about Ben. The recorder clicked and stopped. Daniel pressed the button again. Nothing. Ben who? Maggie said. Daniel checked the device. Dead battery or corrupted file. Damn it. Maggie took a step away from the open locker and wrapped both arms around herself. Daniel could see the panic building in her face now, the kind that came not from loud danger but from a whole life suddenly no longer making sense. Danny, if this is real. It's real. No. I mean, if this is as real as it looks, then why my name? What does last clean signature point mean? Daniel studied the papers again. Maybe because your office processed records nobody expected anyone to question. I question things all the time. I know. Maggie let out a bitter breath. No, you think you know, but people don't notice the difference between somebody who files papers and somebody who reads them. I read everything. Every strange easement, every rushed transfer, every missing attachment. I file incident notes when things don't line up. Daniel looked at her. Did you file incident notes on any of this? She didn't answer. That silence told him enough. Maggie. She stared at the floor. A year ago, there was a land transfer near the river that looked wrong. Then a tax adjustment on the same parcel. Then another file tied to a flood repair fund that shouldn't have touched private land. I asked my supervisor about it. He told me to leave it alone. Who was your supervisor? Elliot Voss. Daniel knew the name. County administrator. Church deacon. Smiled too much. Did you leave it alone? Maggie laughed once, almost choking on it. I made copies. Daniel's heartbeat kicked harder. Where are they? At home. He opened his mouth to say something, but footsteps sounded in the corridor. Both of them froze. A moment later, the basement door upstairs opened and closed. Voices drifted down, muffled. Daniel quietly shut the locker and slipped the recorder into his jacket. Maggie stuffed the documents back into the envelope. They stood in the stale basement light, listening. One voice laughed. Another coughed. Not coming their way. Daniel motioned for her to move. They walked back up the hall, trying to look ordinary. Halfway to the stairs, Maggie whispered, "What if Calder already knows?" "Then he knows somebody moved before him," Daniel said, "which means we don't have much time." They came up into the main level just as a deputy entered through the front doors. He nodded politely at Daniel, then headed for the sheriff's office. Maggie stopped in the side corridor and caught Daniel's arm. "Mom," she said. He blinked. "What? You forgot. We're supposed to take Mom to Dr. Levin at 11. He stared at her in disbelief until he realized she wasn't being absurd. She was trying to stay anchored to normal life by force. Their mother, Jean Harper, had spent the last 6 months in and out of appointments after a stroke that left her right hand weak and her speech slightly uneven when she got tired. "Right," Daniel said softly. Maggie's eyes filled, but she kept them from spilling over. "I can't drag her into this. We won't. You say that like you can control it." Daniel almost said no, then stopped. Nothing about today was under control. "Get through the morning," he said. "Act normal. Don't tell anybody about the key, the locker, none of it. And you? I'm going to the bank. Why? Because dead accountant. Remember?" She grabbed his sleeve before he could turn away. "Danny, don't do this by yourself." He looked down at her hand on his arm and suddenly saw their whole childhood in fragments. Maggie at 16 helping him clean blood off his knuckles after he punched a wall instead of their father. Maggie at 22 taking care of their mother after Daniel disappeared for 3 months to work pipeline jobs in Oklahoma and forgot that bills still came due at home. Maggie always staying, Daniel always leaving when life got too tight around the throat. He covered her hand with his own. "I'm not doing it by myself," he said. "You're already in it." She let go. "That is not comforting." "I know." He left the courthouse through the side door and drove straight to Mid-State Community Bank. The branch sat on the corner of Main and Fulton in a brick building with fake colonial shutters and a sign promising hometown trust. Daniel parked across the street and watched the front entrance. He had expected patrol cars or some sign of upheaval if an employee had just been murdered. There was nothing. Customers came and went, carrying deposit slips and coffee cups. An old man argued with a teller through the glass. Life continuing again. Daniel went inside. The bank smelled like printer, toner, and carpet cleaner. A young teller with a bright smile asked if she could help him. "I need to talk to somebody about Edward Rains," Daniel said. The smile faltered. "Mr. Rains is not in today." "I know." He leaned slightly closer. "Who's the manager?" 10 minutes later, he sat in a small office with branch manager Linda Perez, a woman in her 40s wearing a navy blazer, and the expression of someone who had spent years translating other people's panic into manageable paperwork. She folded her hands on the desk. Mr. Harper, I'm sorry, but if this is about Mr. Raines, we can't discuss personnel matters. Daniel had decided on the drive over that partial truth might get him further than a lie. He died this morning, he said. At the gas station on Route 17. I was with him when it happened. Linda's face changed instantly. What? Before he died, he said something that makes me think he was in trouble over something tied to this bank. Linda stood so abruptly her chair rolled back. For a second, Daniel thought she might throw him out. Instead, she crossed to the office door and shut it. When she turned back, her voice was lower. Did he tell you anything specific? Daniel watched her carefully. Why? Her eyes hardened. Because Eddie was scared for months. Daniel said nothing. Linda rubbed one hand over her mouth and sat back down. He told me he'd found irregular transfers. He wanted to report them higher, but every time he pushed, somebody from county oversight or the sheriff's office suddenly wanted updated audit files or private review meetings. It felt wrong. Daniel leaned forward. Why didn't you go to state authorities? Linda gave him a look almost pitying in its bleakness. You ever try to go around local power in a county like this? The minute you ask the wrong question, every person who signs your permits, approves your security, inspects your building, or smiles at your children's school fundraiser knows your name. Daniel looked away. Maple Ridge, in one sentence. Eddie gave me a thumb drive last week, Linda said. Told me if anything happened to him, I should get it out of town. I haven't yet. Daniel's pulse surged. Where is it? She hesitated. Why would I tell you? Because he said Maggie Harper wasn't compromised, and because Calder's name is on documents in a courthouse locker. Linda went completely still. Daniel saw calculation in her eyes, then fear winning. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and removed a sealed envelope. I was going to take this to my sister in Knoxville tonight, she said. Then Eddie stopped answering calls. Then I saw the sheriff's cruiser outside this morning and decided maybe I should wait. Daniel took the envelope, but didn't open it yet. Do you know what's on it? Copies of account trails, I think, Eddie said. If you follow enough small thefts, eventually you find the big one they're really protecting. Daniel nodded slowly. Linda looked at him hard. If you're smart, you'll leave town with that. He almost laughed. My mother's in rehab. My sister works at the courthouse. Leaving isn't that simple. It never is, Linda said. That's why people like Calder stay powerful. Daniel slipped the envelope inside his jacket. Did Eddie mention Ben something? Linda frowned. Ben? The recorder cut off, he said. Ask about Ben. Her face tightened again. Ben Keller. He used to do demolition contracts for the county. Died in a drunk driving crash last year. Used to? After the flood recovery grants came in, his company suddenly got every emergency cleanup contract west of town. Linda lowered her eyes. 3 weeks before he died, he closed all his accounts and wired most of his money somewhere I couldn't trace. Daniel stood. Where does his widow live? Trailer park off Miller Road. Thank you. Linda rose too. Mr. Harper. He paused at the door. If you get the chance, she said quietly, don't just survive this. Finish it. Outside, daylight had sharpened into noon glare. Daniel climbed into his truck and finally opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a USB drive and one folded page from Eddie Raines in neat accountant handwriting. If I am dead, the county annex fire from 2022 was arson used to destroy originals. Compare digital backups to church reimbursement ledgers. Look at Street Luke's. Daniel sat motionless with the paper in his hand. Street Luke's was the big church outside town that ran food drives, shelter beds in winter, and recovery meetings in the annex hall. Sheriff Calder's wife chaired the charity board. Maggie texted then. Mom's appointment delayed. Sheriff was in records asking weird questions about basement storage. Daniel's jaw tightened. He typed back. Go home sick. Get the copies. Don't go alone. Her reply came fast. Too late. I'm already parking. Daniel called immediately. She answered, whispering. I'm at the house. Why'd you go without telling me? Because you were busy playing detective. He heard a door creak in the background, and the blood in his body seemed to turn to ice. Maggie, he said, voice suddenly sharp. Are you alone? Silence. Then a man's voice in the distance inside the house. Ma'am? Maggie inhaled hard. Danny. He was already starting the truck. Get out now. There's a deputy here. Daniel slammed the gear into reverse so hard the truck jerked. Which deputy? Ronan Pike. Daniel knew Pike. Young, eager, liked by everybody. What does he want? Maggie's voice dropped to a thread. He says Sheriff Calder sent him to check on me because I looked upset at work. Daniel pulled into traffic, tires barking against pavement. Listen to me. Go out the back. He's between me and the kitchen. He could hear the deputy more clearly now. "Miss Harper? You still on the phone?" Daniel gripped the wheel until his fingers hurt. "Maggie, do not tell him anything. Not about the locker, not about the papers. Nothing." Her breath was shaking. "Danny, he's asking who I'm talking to." Daniel turned onto Oak Street too fast. The truck fishtailed. "Tell him it's Mom's doctor." Another pause. Then Maggie said, louder now, "It's Dr. Levin's office." Pike's voice came back, polite and almost friendly. "Mind if I speak with them a second?" Daniel's chest tightened. "Hang up," he hissed. Maggie didn't. "Miss Harper?" Pike said again, closer this time. Daniel could hear footsteps. Then Maggie's voice changed. It went flat in a way Daniel had only heard a few times in his life, usually right before she decided to do something reckless in the name of dignity. "Deputy Pike," she said, "you need to leave my house." Daniel heard the scrape of a chair, then Pike's tone lost its softness. "Sheriff just wants to make sure everybody's all right. Then he can call me." Daniel was already tearing down Miller Crossroad when Maggie made a sound, small and involuntary, and the line rattled like the phone had been grabbed. Daniel shouted her name. The call went dead. Daniel threw the phone onto the passenger seat and drove the last mile like he had forgotten what brakes were for. Oak turned into gravel into a narrow county lane, lined with pines and chain-link fences, and then the Harper house came into view, behind its sagging porch and half-dead azalea bushes. A sheriff's cruiser sat crooked in the driveway with the driver's door open. Daniel didn't stop to think. He cut the truck across the yard, jumped out before it fully settled, and sprinted toward the front door. It was half open. "Maggie!" he shouted. No answer. The living room looked wrong in the way violence always does when it enters an ordinary place. One lamp was on its side. Their mother's Afghan had been dragged off the couch. A dining chair lay broken near the hallway. Daniel moved fast, checking the kitchen, the bathroom, the back porch. Empty. Then he heard a muffled sound from his mother's bedroom. He shoved the door open and found Maggie on the floor with her wrists zip-tied behind her back and a strip of duct tape hanging loose against her neck where she had managed to tear it away. Her left cheek was red. Daniel dropped to his knees and cut the plastic with the pocket knife he always carried for work. "You hurt?" he asked. Maggie sat up, breathing hard. "I'm fine. That's not what I asked. He hit me once. I'm fine." He pulled the remaining tape free. She immediately pushed herself to her feet and looked around the room as if searching for something she had lost. "The copies?" she said. Daniel's stomach dropped. "He took them?" She nodded, furious tears bright in her eyes but not falling. "I had them in the closet in Mom's old sewing box." He knew exactly where to look. He came in smiling like he was checking on me. Then he asked if I had taken anything home from work that didn't belong there. I lied. He smiled again. I knew then. Daniel looked at the open closet. Drawers had been yanked out and dumped. Clothes were trampled into the carpet. Which way did he go? 10 minutes maybe. He took my phone too, but I grabbed it when he was dragging me in here. That's why the call dropped. Daniel stepped toward the window and saw the deputy's cruiser still in the driveway. If he left, why's the car still here? Maggie's face tightened. Because that's not the car he came in. Daniel turned. What? The cruiser was already here when I pulled up. Empty. He came in a black SUV from behind the shed. Daniel felt every muscle in his back go rigid. The same one from the gas station. Maggie frowned. What SUV? Never mind. He moved to the hallway and listened. Quiet. Birds outside. The distant hum of traffic from the state road. We need to go. Maggie caught his arm. Mom. That word hit harder than anything else in the room. Their mother was staying at the rehab wing of St. Catherine's since the stroke, but the house still felt like it belonged to her breathing presence. Every lamp, every crocheted pillow, every bottle of generic vitamins on the kitchen counter. We can't come back here tonight, Maggie said. I know, and they'll look for us at the hospital. Daniel made himself think. Not panic. Think. He went to the sink, splashed water on a dish towel, and handed it to Maggie for her cheek. Then he picked up the house landline and dialed from memory. Ben Keller's widow answered on the fourth ring with a cautious, "Hello? Mrs. Keller, my name is Daniel Harper. I need to ask you about your husband." Silence. Then a guarded, tired voice. "Who gave you this number?" "Someone from the bank." "Then tell the bank I paid off what I could." "It's not about money." He lowered his voice. "It's about why Ben died." Another silence, longer this time. When she spoke again, the weariness was still there, but fear had joined it. "Don't call here," she said. "They listen." The line went dead. Daniel set the receiver down slowly. Maggie had been watching him. "So that's bad," she said. "Yeah." He looked at the broken living room again, at the marks of Pike's boots on the floor. And a thought that had been circling all morning finally landed cleanly. This wasn't just about stealing, it was about control. About making sure every person in town who saw the edges of the thing understood the cost of saying it out loud. "Maggie," he said, "we need to get to St. Catherine's before they do." Her face changed. "You think they'd use Mom?" "I think Calder uses whatever works." They left in Daniel's truck, taking the back roads to avoid Main Street. Maggie sat rigid beside him with an ice pack from the freezer pressed to her cheek. She had found her purse under the kitchen table and was using the cracked screen of her recovered phone to try to log in to county backup files. "The network won't let me in," she muttered. "Remote access is blocked." Daniel gripped the wheel. "Can they wipe what you saw?" "Maybe not everything. Depends how far back the backups sync and whether Voss has admin rights." "You think he does?" She gave him a dead look. "Danny, this county gives deacons admin rights over things God never intended." He almost smiled despite himself. That was the worst part of fear in a family. Even in the middle of it, people still sounded like themselves. St. Catherine's sat on a low hill outside town, a square concrete hospital added onto in pieces over 40 years, until it looked less like a building than an argument. Daniel parked near rehab and scanned the lot. 2 sheriff's units. One marked, one unmarked. Maggie saw them too and swore under her breath. "Maybe they're here for something else," she said. But neither of them believed it. They entered through physical therapy and found their mother in a wheelchair near the dayroom window, wearing a pale blue cardigan and reading glasses she only needed when she was too stubborn to admit she needed them. Jean Harper looked up, saw their faces, and knew instantly that something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. Her words were a little slower since the stroke, but not soft. Jean had never been soft. Maggie knelt in front of her before Daniel could answer. "We need to take you out of here for the day," she said. "Why?" "Because we do." Their mother's gaze went from Maggie's reddened cheek to Daniel's bloodshot eyes. "Police?" she asked. Daniel crouched too. "Mom, can you trust us for 5 minutes without questions?" Jean looked at him a long time. Daniel hated that even now, after everything, part of him still felt like a boy waiting for judgment, from the only parent who had ever stayed. Finally, she said, "That depends. Are you lying?" "No." "Then get my purse." They were halfway down the rehab hallway with Jean's wheelchair when Deputy Pike stepped out from the nurse's station. His uniform was neat again. No sign of the violence from the house except a fresh scratch on his wrist. "Miss Harper," he said pleasantly to Jean, "we just need a quick word with your daughter." Maggie stopped so abruptly the wheelchair bumped her knees. Daniel moved in front without thinking. Pike's gaze flicked to Daniel, then to Maggie, then to the older woman in the chair. "Everything all right at home?" Pike asked. Maggie's answer came cold and immediate. "No," Pike smiled faintly. "Sorry to hear that." Daniel wanted to hit him so badly his hands went numb. But Pike's right hand was resting near his holster, and the hallway was full of staff and patients. Wrong place, wrong moment. "We're leaving," Daniel said. Pike nodded as if he were allowing it. "Sheriff Calder would appreciate a call when you get settled. He's concerned there may be some confusion about county property removed from the records office." Jean looked up sharply. "County property?" Pike turned the smile on her. "Just paperwork, ma'am." Jean's good hand tightened on the blanket over her lap. "My daughter doesn't steal paperwork." Pike's expression didn't change, but Daniel saw irritation flash behind it. "Nobody said she did." Jean held his stare. Weak from the stroke or not, she still had that old-school cafeteria manager authority that once made 6th graders cry over stolen pudding cups. "Then stop implying it," she said. For one tiny second, Daniel saw Pike unsure of himself. Small towns ran on hierarchies, and for all Calder's power, there were still older loyalties that had weight. People knew Jean Harper. She had fed half the town's children for 20 years. Pike stepped aside. "Have a good day," he said. Daniel wheeled their mother past him without another word. They loaded Jean into the truck slowly. Once the doors were shut and the hospital was behind them, Jean said, "Now tell me what kind of hell you two are in." Daniel and Maggie exchanged a look. There was no version of this that kept her out anymore, so Daniel told her most of it while driving toward the county line. Not every detail. Not the blood on the pavement or the exact way Maggie had looked zip-tied on the floor, but enough. The dying accountant. The locker. Calder. The papers. Pike. The missing copies. Jean listened without interruption, her face harder with every mile. When Daniel finished, she said, "Your father knew." Both siblings turned to look at her so fast Daniel nearly drifted onto the shoulder. "What?" Maggie said. Jean kept her eyes on the road ahead. "Not all of it, but some." Daniel felt his pulse bang in his ears. Their father, Roy Harper, had died 8 years earlier After a crane collapse at a construction site west of Knoxville, Daniel had built an entire private theology around never becoming him. Roy had been charming to strangers, unpredictable at home, and perpetually one bad week away from blowing up everybody else's peace. "Mom," Daniel said slowly, "what are you talking about?" Jean adjusted the blanket over her knees with her weak hand, stubbornly refusing help. "About a year before he died, your father started doing repair work out at Street Luke's annex and some warehouse lots by the river. He came home angry, wouldn't say why. Then one night he told me if anything happened to him, I should never trust a man who smiled too quickly in church." Maggie stared at her. "Calder?" I asked if he meant the sheriff. He wouldn't answer. Jean's mouth tightened. "Your father had a talent for trying to protect people by saying half of what mattered and none of what was useful." Daniel looked back at the road, sick with a familiar old resentment. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" "Because then he drank for 3 days, picked a fight with you over nothing, and I decided maybe he was just drunk and dramatic." Her voice wavered for the first time. "Then the annex fire happened. He came home white as a sheet and said there were things in this town that punished curiosity. 2 months later, he took a job out of state." Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. "He came back." "Yes," Jean said, "and he was different. Quieter, like he'd agreed to something with life that I had not been consulted on." Nobody spoke for a while. The truck rolled past soybean fields, a shuttered bait shop, a cemetery with flags left from last Memorial Day. Daniel had spent years blaming his father for every failure of nerve in the family. Now, against his own wishes, he felt the possibility of pity opening where anger had lived. "Where are we going?" Maggie asked finally. Daniel answered before he had fully decided. "Street Luke's." Maggie looked at him like he had lost his mind. "The church?" Eddie's note said, "Compare digital backups to church reimbursement ledgers." "And Calder's wife runs the charity board," Maggie snapped. "Exactly. Nobody hides rot like respectable people." Jean gave a dry, almost impressed sound. "Well, that part, at least, your father would agree with." Street. Luke's stood just outside Maple Ridge on a broad stretch of land with a white steeple, 2 annex buildings, a playground, and a gravel overflow lot used on holidays and funerals. Daniel parked behind the fellowship hall, where a line of donation bins sat beneath a faded mural of praying hands. The place looked quiet. Mid-afternoon sun washed everything in a false softness. Maggie helped Jean into a borrowed transport chair they had taken from rehab, with the promise to return it tomorrow. "If somebody sees us?" Maggie asked. "Then we're visiting," Daniel said. "Mom likes church." Jean gave him a flat look. "Don't oversell it." They entered through the side hall. The building smelled like lemon polish, old coffee, and fabric softener. A secretary at the front desk looked up from a church bulletin layout. "Can I help you?" Daniel gave her his best tired son smile. "My mom wanted to sit in the chapel for a minute. Rough week." The secretary's whole body softened. "Of course, honey." She pointed down the corridor, past the nursery. While Maggie took Jean toward the small prayer chapel, Daniel drifted toward the rear offices. Closed doors, framed mission photos, 1 storage room, 1 locked file room. He passed the charity board office and saw on the wall a framed certificate for Street Luke's Recovery Annex Reimbursement Partnership with Maple County Emergency Response Board. Calder's signature sat beside Pastor Neil Whitmore's and County Administrator Elliot Voss's. Whitmore, Parcel 14C. Daniel's mind clicked connections together too fast to feel stable. He tried the file room knob. Locked. A voice behind him said, "You looking for something?" Daniel turned. Pastor Neil Whitmore stood in the hall wearing jeans, a tucked-in blue button-down, and the kind of open expression that had probably reassured grieving families for 25 years. His hair was gray at the temples. His smile was patient. "Bathroom," Daniel lied. Whitmore nodded toward the opposite end of the corridor. "Other way." Daniel started to move past him, but the pastor glanced toward the chapel and his face changed slightly. "Jean Harper?" he said. "I didn't know she was back on her feet." "Wheelchair today," Daniel said. "Step at a time." Whitmore looked at him longer than felt friendly. "Your father used to say that." Daniel stopped. "You knew my father. Most everybody in town knew Roy." Whitmore's smile thinned with memory. "He did some work for us. Got angry about invoices that were above his pay grade." Daniel heard the phrase and knew immediately it was chosen. Not accidental. "And did those invoices stay above his pay grade after the annex fire?" Whitmore's eyes sharpened. The hallway seemed to narrow around them. "That is a dangerous question," the pastor said quietly. Daniel took 1 step closer. "Maybe I'm tired of safe ones." Whitmore's gaze flicked toward the chapel again. "Your family should leave." Why? Because once the wrong men realize you know enough to be inconvenient, they stop caring about who else they frighten. Wrong men like Calder? Whitmore looked past Daniel as if checking the empty hall. When he spoke again, the pastoral warmth was gone. Your father found original ledgers hidden in the annex maintenance office before the fire. He confronted me first, not Calder. I told him to let me handle it. Daniel's throat tightened. Did you? Whitmore's silence answered. He thought you sold him out, Daniel said. No, Whitmore replied, and for the first time there was something raw in his face. I thought I could contain it. I thought if I kept the charity wing open, kept the shelter beds funded, kept the food pantry running, maybe I could trade quiet for harm reduction. That is how corruption introduces itself to decent people. Not as greed, as compromise. Daniel stared at him, disgust and grim recognition mixing in equal parts. So what now? Whitmore looked him straight in the eye. Now you are far past the point where moral cleanliness matters. What matters is proof. Calder keeps the real books off-site now. Not here. Not the courthouse. Ben Keller moved them before he died. Daniel heard footsteps approaching from the front offices. Whitmore's face settled back into something neutral. Behind the old river warehouse, he said, under his breath. Storm shelter access hatch. If it's still there, then he raised his voice. Bathroom's down that way, son. A church volunteer appeared around the corner, carrying folded blankets. Daniel nodded stiffly and walked off, pulse hammering. When he rejoined Maggie and Jean in the chapel, both women knew from his face that the day had just tilted again. What happened? Maggie whispered. Daniel looked at the votive candles, the wooden cross, the soft late light through colored glass. Then he said, Dad wasn't crazy. He found it first. He told them enough to move them. No more, no less. Maggie sat down hard in the chapel pew. Jean closed her eyes for a second, not in prayer but in exhausted acceptance, like one more grief had finally found the right shelf to sit on. The river warehouse, Maggie said. That's where Ben Keller's old demolition trucks used to park. Daniel nodded. Then that's where we go. No, Jean said. Both of them looked at her. She held Daniel's gaze with a steadiness that made him feel 12 years old. You go. Maggie stays with me. Maggie's head snapped around. Absolutely not. Jean ignored her. They already put hands on you once today. They expect Daniel to act angry. They may not expect him to act smart. Let him use that. Daniel almost objected on reflex, then realized his mother was right, in a brutal way. Maggie was too exposed now. Pike knew she had something. Calder knew she had looked. Daniel was still only a witness in their eyes, dangerous but perhaps not yet fully informed. I can't leave you two alone, he said. Jean gave him the look that had once stopped him from sneaking out windows. You're not leaving us alone. You're leaving us together. Maggie leaned forward, furious. Mom, he could get killed. Jean turned her head toward her daughter, stroke slowed but iron underneath. Then one of us needs to act like a Harper and not a rabbit. The words hung there. Daniel flinched because he heard Roy in them and Jean too, and all the old family damage packed into one commandment about courage. Maggie looked away, wounded by the truth and by the unfairness of it. Daniel crouched in front of both of them. I go in, I get what I can, and I get out. Then we take everything to state police or federal, whichever is farther from Calder's reach. Maggie swallowed hard. And if there's nothing there? Daniel thought of Eddie Raines dying on concrete. Thought of his father coming home from work, changed in a way no child can name until years later. Then at least we'll know where the lie ends. Then at least we'll know where the lie ends. Daniel left them in the chapel with the secretary's promise to bring water and not ask questions, then drove alone toward the river as the afternoon light began to flatten into that colorless hour when everything in a small town looks briefly abandoned even when it isn't. The old warehouse district sat west of Maple Ridge, beyond the grain silos and the junkyard, where the road narrowed and the cell signal weakened, and nobody came unless they had business nobody else needed to understand. Daniel had worked near those buildings a dozen times over the years, replacing rusted roof panels, welding broken gates, hauling concrete chunks into rented dumpsters. He knew the smell of the place before he saw it. Mud, oil, mold, river rot, hot metal cooling into evening. He parked a quarter-mile away behind a line of scrub oak and walked the rest with the USB drive from Linda Perez in one pocket and Eddie Raines's note folded inside his wallet. He had no real plan beyond getting in and getting out, and that knowledge sat in him like a splinter. The closer he got to the warehouse, the more his father moved through his head in fragments. Roy Harper standing in the backyard with a beer and sawdust on his jeans, laughing too loud at nothing. Roy smashing a plate against the sink because a bill arrived on the wrong day. Roy kneeling once, only once, after yelling at Daniel for crashing a dirt bike into a drainage ditch. putting both hands on the boy's shoulders and saying in a voice full of some cracked, private shame, "When men get cornered, Danny, they start mistaking damage for strength." Daniel had spent years thinking that was one of his father's many broken little wisdom speeches, the kind men gave when they wanted to sound reflective without changing anything. Now he wondered if Roy had been trying, badly and too late, to warn him about something larger than himself. The warehouse came into view through weeds and chain link. It was a long concrete block building with sheet metal siding mottled by rust and a loading dock half collapsed on one side. Ben Keller's demolition company logo was still faintly visible on a panel near the back. A cartoon wrecking ball, and the words "Keller Site Clearance." Daniel crouched near the brush line and scanned the property. No visible vehicles, no people. One security light over the rear service door, dead. The river moved sluggish and brown beyond the levee, carrying the last light in broken pieces. He circled wide behind the building, until he found what Whitmore had described. A storm shelter access hatch set into the ground beneath a stack of warped pallets and old corrugated tin. Somebody had hidden it in plain sight, not by burying it, but by making it look like one more ugly piece of industrial junk. Daniel heaved the pallets aside and found a steel door with a recessed handle and a heavy padlock. He stared at it, then laughed under his breath once in disbelief. "Of course," he muttered. Then he went to the loading dock, found a bent length of rebar, and jammed it through the lock loop. The first pull did nothing. The second sent pain shooting through his shoulder. The third popped the corroded bracket from the concrete instead of breaking the lock. Good enough. He opened the hatch. Damp air rushed up from below, cold and mineral and sealed. A narrow staircase disappeared into darkness. Daniel clicked on the flashlight from his glove box and descended. The shelter was larger than he expected, maybe an old Cold War-era storm bunker converted years later for storage. Concrete walls sweated with moisture. Shelving units lined the room. Plastic-wrapped boxes sat stacked in rows. 2 filing cabinets, a folding table. A humming dehumidifier in the corner plugged into a fresh extension line running up through the ceiling. This was no abandoned hiding place. Somebody maintained it. Daniel moved fast. The first boxes held church donation records. The second, county reimbursement forms. The third, contracts tied to emergency response grants, all clean copies with signatures and codes. It was the fourth box that turned his stomach. Cash disbursement ledgers. Handwritten sidebooks. Dates, names, account numbers, percentages. He saw Calder's initials repeatedly. Voss, Whitmore, Keller. He saw line items marked Shelter Fire, Cleanup and Storm, Loss Reclassification, and Opioid Outreach Bridge Fund. Each one routed through shell entities before feeding into private accounts. He took out his phone and started photographing every page. Then he opened the top drawer of the first filing cabinet and froze. Inside sat a manila folder labeled Harper, Oro Y. Daniel stared at it for 3 full seconds before touching it. His hand actually shook. When he opened the folder, a set of incident photos slid loose into his lap. The annex fire, burned joists, melted wiring, charred filing shelves, and under the photos, a typed statement with Roy Harper's signature at the bottom. Daniel read the first lines and felt the room tilt. I, Roy Harper, attest that I observed no suspicious activity prior to the electrical fire at Street, Luke's Annex, and have no basis to suspect criminal interference. The signature was his father's. The words were not. Daniel knew it the way people know handwriting from birthday cards and permission slips and angry notes left on refrigerators. Roy had signed under pressure or threat. Beneath that was another page, handwritten this time, not signed, folded into quarters. Danny or Maggie. If somehow this reaches you, I did not tell the truth because they made it plain your names could become part of the problem. If I keep quiet, maybe the danger stops with me. If it doesn't, then I was a coward and I'm sorry. Daniel sat back on his heels. Every old injury he carried from his father, splitting open and rearranging itself in new order. Not healing. Nothing that easy. Just changing shape. His eyes burned. He shoved the paper into his jacket and kept searching, anger now working like fuel through shock. In the second cabinet he found external hard drives, sealed envelopes, and a black ledger with years of handwritten entries. He photographed everything he could, then started loading the most crucial items into a contractor trash bag from a supply shelf. Ledgers. Roy's folder. The black book, a stack of backup drives, enough to prove theft. Maybe enough to prove conspiracy. He had just zipped the bag when footsteps sounded above him on the metal staircase hatch. Daniel killed the flashlight instinctively and listened. Voices. 2 men, one of them Pike. He recognized the younger, slightly nasal eagerness instantly. Told you the lock was broken, Pike said. Then he's here, or he was, another voice replied. Calder. Daniel's blood went cold and hot at once. He looked around for another exit and found none. The shelter had been designed to keep storms out, not give hunted men choices. The hatch groaned open above. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness. "Daniel," Calder called down in the tone of a man asking somebody to step out from behind a joke that had gone too far. "You don't want to make this worse." Daniel grabbed the rebar and stepped behind a shelving unit. Pike descended first, gun drawn, beam sweeping. Calder followed without hurry. Daniel could smell the sheriff's aftershave before he saw him fully, the same clean cedar note that lingered in county meeting rooms and charity golf tournaments. "You scared my deputy, putting hands on state property," Calder said. "Your deputy tied up my sister in my mother's bedroom," Pike said. "She's okay, isn't she?" With such offended innocence that Daniel nearly charged him then and there. Instead, he stayed where he was. "You killed Eddie Raines," Daniel said. Calder sighed, and there was genuine weariness in it. The weariness of a man annoyed at being forced into honesty by circumstances he considers beneath him. "No," he said. "I didn't. But I did fail to stop consequences once he decided he was a crusader." Pike shifted his aim toward the shelves. "You can still walk away from this, Daniel." Daniel almost laughed. "You broke into my house." "I checked on your sister," Pike replied. Then she got dramatic. Calder held up a hand without looking at Pike. "Enough." His flashlight landed on the open cabinets, the disturbed boxes, the missing files. "I wish you hadn't come down here," he said. "I really do. Your father forced my hand the same way." The words hit like a fist. Daniel stepped out from behind the shelving before caution could stop him. "Don't say his name." Pike immediately swung the gun onto him. Calder stayed still. "Why not?" the sheriff asked quietly. "Because he mattered to you only when he could be frightened." "That isn't true." "Then what is true?" Daniel snapped. "That you stole money from addicts and flood victims and church food drives? That you got decent people to sign around it? That you threatened my father until he lied for you?" Calder's expression changed then, not into guilt but into something more insulting. "Conviction. What's true," he said, "is that counties like this survive on arrangements. The state forgets us unless there's a ribbon cutting or a disaster. Federal money arrives attached to promises nobody here has the staff to fulfill. Churches patch the holes. Private men move the money where it can do some actual good. And yes, some of it sticks to hands along the way. That is how every machine runs." Daniel stared at him in disgust. "You rehearsed that?" Calder ignored the jab. "You think if this all goes public, Maple Ridge gets purified?" "No. The shelter closes. The food pantry closes. The rehab beds get cut. Every legitimate thing built on these channels collapses, along with the dirty parts, and the people hurt first will be the same ones nobody around here writes speeches about." Daniel heard the trap in it, because it was the same trap Whitmore had confessed to. Not greed first. Compromise. Community used as collateral. "So you just decided your corruption was efficient," Daniel said. "I decided survival was uglier than slogans," Calder replied. He took one step closer. "You have a mother in rehab and a sister in county employment. Think very carefully about whether martyrdom feeds them." Pike said, "Sheriff, let me take the bag." Daniel tightened his grip on the rebar. For a moment, the whole room narrowed into angles and breath and the bright circle of Pike's weapon. Daniel knew how quickly men died in close spaces from bad decisions. He also knew Pike was nervous and Calder was calculating, and both of them were still assuming he'd react like Roy used to, loud and direct and breakable. "You threatened my father with us," Daniel said. Calder's silence confirmed it. "No," the sheriff said after a beat. "I made him understand reality." Something in Daniel settled then, not calm exactly, but a cold alignment. He heard his father again. Men get cornered. They start mistaking damage for strength. Daniel looked at Pike, young enough to still believe his uniform made him part of order instead of somebody else's panic. Then he looked at Calder, who had built a whole private empire by wearing public concern like a second skin. "You know what my father really did wrong?" Daniel asked. Neither man answered. He believed if he absorbed enough fear, it would stop with him. Daniel swung the rebar hard into the dehumidifier. The metal housing burst with sparks and a crack like a gunshot. Lights died. The shelter dropped into darkness. Pike shouted. Daniel lunged low, hitting him at the knees. The deputy's shot went off into concrete, deafening in the enclosed room. Daniel ripped the gun hand sideways until Pike screamed and lost grip. Calder swore somewhere to the left. Daniel didn't chase voices. He grabbed the bag, scrambled toward the stairs, and slammed shoulder first into the wall before finding them. A hand caught his jacket. Calder. Daniel drove an elbow backward into ribs and felt the air leave the older man. Then he climbed blind, 2 steps at a time, hauling the bag. Pike was behind him, cursing, recovering, Daniel hit the hatch, shoved through, and rolled onto gravel just as another shot punched sparks off the metal frame beside his head. He ran. Not toward his truck. Too obvious. He cut through weeds, down the levee slope, and into the scrub near the riverbank with the bag thudding against his side. Behind him, men shouted his name. Flashlights swept the darkening lot. Daniel kept moving until the mud sucked at his boots and cattails slapped his face. He crouched behind a fallen cottonwood trunk and forced himself not to breathe like prey. Voices moved upslope. Pike wanted to search the river edge. Calder said no, not yet. Too much noise, too many variables. After several minutes, the lights receded. Daniel stayed still, 10 more. His whole body hurt. His right hand was bleeding from somewhere near the thumb. His ears rang from the gunshot, but the bag was still with him, and inside it sat the proof that had bent half the town around a hidden axis for years. He took out his phone. 1 bar of signal. 2 missed calls from Maggie. A text from an unknown number had arrived 3 minutes earlier. Bring it to the old county fairgrounds. Come alone if you want your family safe. Daniel read it twice. No signature. None needed. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Final arc, his mind said with mechanical cruelty, as if life were something you could structure once enough damage had accumulated. He called Maggie first. She answered on the first ring. Danny? I'm okay. He heard her breath catch. Where are you? Near the river. I got the records. Thank God. He leaned his forehead against the wet bark of the fallen tree. Listen to me carefully. You and Mom need to leave Street Luke's now. We already did. What? Pastor Whitmore told us Calder's people might circle back. We're at Linda Perez's sister's place outside Knoxville. Linda drove us herself. Daniel blinked, stunned by the sudden appearance of competence from all directions. You're safe? Safer than you. He almost laughed again, but it came out broken. Probably. Maggie's voice softened. Where are you really? He looked across the black river water. I think he wants to trade. No. Maggie. No, Danny. We go straight to the State Bureau. We send everything everywhere. Media, too. And if he has people on the road between here and Knoxville, then we keep driving. Her voice cracked for the first time all day. I am so tired of him deciding what fear costs. Daniel shut his eyes again. Me too. He heard their mother in the background asking if it was him. Maggie answered yes, then came back on. Mom says, ask yourself one question. What? Whether saving us tonight destroys us later. Daniel stared at the text message still glowing on the screen. Fairgrounds. Alone. The old county fairgrounds sat north of town, empty most of the year except for flea markets, campaign barbecues, and demolition derbies. Public enough for witnesses if timed wrong. Remote enough for violence if timed right. Calder was counting on Daniel being his father's son, counting on blood before strategy. Tell Mom, Daniel said slowly. I'm finally asking better questions. He hung up before Maggie could hear the rest forming. Then he called 911 from the riverbank and asked for state police, not local dispatch. He gave names, locations, the warehouse, the documents, the church, the bank, the courthouse locker, the hospital confrontation, everything he could fit into one breathless report before the operator tried to transfer him. Then he sent every photo from his phone to 3 places at once. Linda Perez, Maggie, and a regional news tip line he found through sheer signal luck and spite. Only after he had done that did he stand, sling the bag over his shoulder, and start toward the road. If Calder wanted the fairgrounds, Daniel would go. But not because he believed in trades anymore. He went because some endings only show their real face when dragged into public. He went because some endings only show their real face when dragged into public. By the time Daniel reached his truck, full dark had settled over Maple County, and the kind of damp southern night that made every sound carry had crept in from the river. He drove without headlights for the first half-mile, then pulled onto the state road and joined ordinary traffic, 2 sedans, and a farm truck heading north, as if this were any other Thursday night in a place where people still argued over football and church bake sales, and whether the diner's pie had gone downhill since the owner's nephew took over. Daniel's hands kept shaking on the wheel. The adrenaline had worn off enough for pain to register clearly now. His shoulder throbbed from the rebar swing. His thumb was split open. Mud had dried stiff on his jeans. He looked like somebody who had crawled through the underside of the town and come back with proof that the whole thing was built on rotten beams. He almost laughed at the image, but there was no humor left in him. Only movement. Only sequence. Get to the fairgrounds. Keep the records. Keep Calder talking if possible. Stay alive long enough for the truth to outrun whatever violence was still coming. He checked his phone at a red light on the edge of town. 3 bars now. A text from Maggie. State investigator called Linda. They're moving. Don't be a hero. Another from an unfamiliar Knoxville number. This is Special Agent Nora Bell, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. We are coordinating with THP and state police. Do not approach suspects alone. Call me now. Daniel stared at the message until the light turned green behind him and somebody honked. He drove on without replying. Not because he didn't trust her, because if he stopped now to explain, to align, to wait, Calder might move first. Public predators always did. They used the lag between accusation and response. The lag was their oxygen. The fairgrounds sat on the north side of Maple Ridge past the high school baseball fields and the feed mill, enclosed by sagging white fencing and a chain-link main gate that was never fully shut unless the county expected revenue. Tonight the gate stood open. Yellow bulbs glowed above the ticket booths. Beyond them stretched the empty dirt midway, rusting livestock barns, and the skeletal silhouette of the old grandstand. Daniel pulled in slowly and parked near the rodeo arena. No other civilian cars. One unmarked SUV by the maintenance shed. One sheriff's cruiser near the livestock pavilion. Calder had chosen the place carefully. Public property, familiar ground, enough open space to see trouble coming, enough structures to hide men. Daniel took the contractor bag and the black ledger from inside it, then slid the rest of the evidence under the bench seat of his truck. If he lost everything at once, then everything died with him. If he kept parts separate, chance widened. He stepped out into the heavy night air and heard the flag line on the grandstand clinking softly against metal poles. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. Nearby, the old loudspeaker system hummed with leftover electricity and nothing else. "Sheriff?" Daniel called. His voice bounced thinly across the empty grounds. A figure emerged from beneath the grandstand lights. Calder, hatless now, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled, looking less like a sheriff than a tired local businessman staying late after a fundraiser. Pike stood 20 feet behind him near the SUV, one hand on his holster. No one else visible. That meant others were probably in the shadows, or Calder wanted Daniel to think they were. "You came," Calder said. "You sounded desperate," Daniel replied. Calder's mouth tightened at that. "Do you have it?" Daniel held up the black ledger. "Some of it. Not enough." "Enough." Calder glanced at the bag on Daniel's shoulder and seemed to weigh whether rushing him would work. Daniel saw the thought cross his face and spoke before it could settle. "State police know about the warehouse. The bank manager has copies. My sister has photos. News has photos. If I disappear, this doesn't disappear." Pike shifted at that, eyes flicking toward Calder. The sheriff kept his gaze on Daniel. "You think quantity equals credibility. It doesn't. Not in a town like this. People believe who they already trust. Then maybe tonight is about changing that." Calder took a step closer. "No. Tonight is about understanding scale. You are one man with family attached. I am not the whole disease, Daniel. Cut me out, and there are still commissioners, contractors, preachers, auditors, campaign donors, state men who enjoyed not looking too closely. You are trying to turn on a floodlight in a county that has survived on shadows for generations." Daniel thought of Whitmore in the church hall saying compromise first, not greed. Thought of Linda Perez sitting rigid behind her desk with a thumb drive she was afraid to mail. Thought of Eddie Raines bleeding onto gas station concrete because he had mistaken the law for rescue. "Maybe survival isn't the same thing as living," Daniel said. Calder sighed. "That sounds good. It will even sound good in newspapers. But the day after this breaks, the people who depended on those channels will still need insulin and rent and beds in winter shelters." Daniel felt the old trap opening again, dressed as pragmatism, sharpened by partial truth. "So what?" he said. "We keep the theft because the bookkeeping includes soup kitchens?" "We keep order," Calder answered. "We correct excess quietly. We protect institutions people can't afford to lose." Pike finally spoke, and his voice carried the brittle conviction of someone repeating what he needed to believe. "Sheriff told me years ago, there's no clean service. Either you do ugly things before chaos hits, or you wait and do uglier things after." Daniel looked at him, this young deputy who had tied up his sister and still wanted the world to call him duty-bound. "Did you tell yourself that when you hit her?" Pike's jaw flexed. "She fought." "Good," Daniel said. Calder turned his head slightly. "Deputy, step back." Pike hesitated, then obeyed by one pace and no more. Daniel noticed then that the sheriff looked tired in a way he hadn't at the courthouse, as if the controlled geometry of his power was finally requiring muscle. Not fear exactly. Effort. The effort of keeping a lie upright once too many people had seen the supports underneath. "What do you want?" Daniel asked. Calder gave a small, almost sad smile. "I want you to be less like your father." The words landed oddly, not as insult, but as invitation. Daniel felt anger rise, and then stop. You don't get to use him anymore, he said quietly. Calder's eyes narrowed. Your father and I understood one another. No, Daniel said. You understood what he loved. A wind moved across the fairgrounds, lifting dust from the empty arena. Somewhere near the livestock barns, a loose metal panel banged once and settled. Daniel heard another sound beneath it then. Tires on gravel outside the main gate. More than one vehicle. Calder heard it too. Pike turned his head sharply. Red and blue flashed briefly against the distant ticket booths, then cut off. Not local. State units running dark the last stretch. Daniel did not smile. He just watched the recognition reach Calder one fraction at a time. You made the call, the sheriff said. I made several. Pike stepped forward instantly, hand on gun. Sheriff, don't, Calder snapped, and the force of it surprised even him. For the first time that night, Pike looked young. Really young. Like a man who had joined up in search of certainty, and found himself standing in an empty fairground, with corruption, gun oil, and a future collapsing faster than he could narrate it. It's over, Daniel said. No, Calder replied, almost reflexively. It's just changing form. That's enough for me. Headlights swept across the fencing now. Doors slammed at the gate. A voice amplified by command, female and sharp, Maple County Sheriff's Office, stay where you are and show your hands. Special Agent Nora Bell crossed into the midway, with 2 state troopers and 3 armed agents spreading behind her in practiced arcs. She wore plain clothes under a tactical vest, hair tied back, expression stripped of anything personal. Calder lifted both hands slowly. Pike didn't. Daniel saw the deputy's panic before anyone else did. It flashed in the tiny dart of his eyes toward the SUV, toward escape, toward some remaining script where loyalty bought rescue. Pike, Daniel said, but it was too late. The deputy yanked his weapon and turned, not toward Daniel, but toward the agents, toward the impossible fantasy that a path still existed through force. 2 troopers shouted at once. Pike fired wild. The gunshot tore the night open. State return fire cracked almost on top of it. Pike staggered backward, hit once high in the chest, once through the shoulder, and slammed against the SUV before sliding down the door onto the dirt. Silence followed, so suddenly it felt staged. Daniel stood perfectly still, heart punching against his ribs. Dust drifted through the arena lights. Calder had not moved. His hands remained raised, but his face had changed. Not grief. Not exactly. More like the exhaustion of a man watching one of his tools break beyond repair. Agent Bell stepped forward with her weapon trained center mass. Thomas Calder, get on your knees. Calder looked at Daniel once. There was accusation in it, but also something stranger, almost contemptuous disappointment, as if Daniel had refused the terms of a hard lesson and chosen instead to be naive in public. Then the sheriff lowered himself slowly onto the dirt. The agents closed in. One cuffed him. Another kicked Pike's weapon away and called for medics already staged at the gate. Bell turned toward Daniel. Mr. Harper? Yeah. Are you armed? No. Put the bag on the ground and step back. He did. 2 agents moved to secure it. Bell kept studying him, taking in the split thumb, the mud, the blood, the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had just lived through the exact type of local collapse state offices always received after the rot had ripened fully. You, Daniel Harper? She asked. Yes. You should have called and waited. Probably. Bell gave a tight nod that might have been irritation or respect, or simply triage. We've got teams at the courthouse, Street Luke's, the warehouse, and Calder's house. Your sister and mother are accounted for. Bank manager too. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. His knees nearly buckled with it. Good. Bell's gaze softened a fraction. We may need a statement tonight. Daniel looked past her at Calder being brought to his feet. You'll get one. Calder heard him and turned just enough to speak over the agent's grip. Make sure you tell them about your pastor, he said. Tell them about the commissioners. Tell them about every woman who signed a reimbursement check, because if she didn't, 15 addicts slept outside in January. Don't let them turn this into one villain and a clean county. That would be another lie. Bell shoved him forward before Daniel could answer, but the words stayed, because that was the worst part. Even cornered, even arrested, Calder was still not entirely wrong. One villain was too simple. One arrest was too neat. The machine had fed people while it stole from them. It had done harm through the language of help. That made every moral line in the county crooked. Daniel looked down at the dirt where Pike had fallen. Medics were kneeling over him, cutting his shirt. Blood soaked fast under the flood of arena lights. Young, arrogant, violent, frightened Pike. He had been a willing hand. He had also been taught. Daniel felt no mercy exactly, but he felt the whole terrible chain of causes pressing down. Agent Bell touched his arm. "Sit before you pass out." He didn't realize how close he was until his legs obeyed instantly. Somebody brought him to the tailgate of a trooper SUV. A paramedic cleaned his hand while Bell's team cataloged the ledger and the bag. Questions came in controlled waves. What did he remove from the warehouse? Who had contacted him? When did the first incident occur? Did he personally witness the homicide of Edward Raines? Daniel answered what he could and said when he didn't know. Somewhere during the second round of questions, Dawn's first pale suggestion began working at the edges of the sky. The fairgrounds looked uglier in that light, more tired, like a set left standing after a show nobody wanted to admit had been real. By 6 in the morning, half the county seemed to know something had happened. Cars idled outside the gate. Reporters from Knoxville arrived before local stations did. Word moved through Maple Ridge in jagged, unofficial channels. Calder arrested, shots fired, state police at the church, records office sealed, county administrator missing, no weight found at a motel, off I-40, church books seized, bank under review. None of it settled into one story yet. Small towns did not absorb truth cleanly. They broke it into rumor first, then loyalty tests, then grief. Bell finally released Daniel into Linda Perez's car just after sunrise. Linda drove him to Knoxville in silence for the first 20 minutes, both of them too tired for comfort. Then she said, "People are going to hate you." Daniel stared out the window at gas stations and billboards and the soft blue rise of morning over East Tennessee. "I know. Some people will call you brave. That one's probably wrong." Linda nodded. "Usually is." At her sister's house, Maggie opened the front door before he reached it. She looked like she hadn't slept in years. Her cheek was more purple now. Her eyes were rimmed red. Daniel barely had time to register her before she pulled him into a hard, furious embrace that felt less like relief than a demand that he stay solid for at least 1 second under her hands. He held her just as tightly. Over her shoulder he saw their mother in the living room recliner. Cardigan still buttoned wrong, chin lifted as if she had been waiting all night not for news but for proof that at least one of her children still knew how to come back. When Maggie let go, she hit him once in the chest. Not hard, just enough. "You didn't answer the agent," she said. "I was busy not dying." "That is not funny. I know." Jean called from the recliner. "Come here, Daniel." He went to her and knelt the way he had in the hospital hallway. She touched the side of his face with her good hand. Her fingers were cool and unsteady. "Did it end?" she asked. Daniel thought about Calder's last words, about Whitmore, Voss, all the names still being pulled loose from ledgers and files. Thought about Pike bleeding in the dirt. Thought about the inevitable hearings, closures, bankruptcies, editorials, accusations, and people whose medication program or winter cot or counseling grant would now evaporate because the money had been dirty and the cleanliness of exposure did not pay utility bills. "No," he said honestly. "It started ending." Jean studied him and nodded once. "That's more truthful anyway." The next 2 weeks broke Maple Ridge open. Pastor Whitmore resigned publicly and then testified privately. Elliot Voss was arrested in North Carolina, trying to board a flight with a passport nobody in town knew he had. County commissioners insisted they had been misled. Some probably had been. Others had merely preferred soft focus. Midstate Community Bank survived, barely, by cooperating early and aggressively. St. Catherine's rehab wing lost 1 grant and nearly lost another until emergency state funding patched the hole for 6 months. St. Luke's food pantry closed for 11 days and then reopened under a volunteer board, led mostly by women who had spent years doing the work while the men made speeches. There were vigils for Eddie Raines. There were also muttered conversations in barbershops and parking lots about how some people should have kept local matters local. Daniel heard all of it, even when he stayed away. Especially then. He gave statements. He sat in rooms with investigators under fluorescent lights and watched his hometown become evidence. Maggie took leave from the records office until the office itself was temporarily shut pending audit. Linda Perez testified. Ben Keller's widow brought forward old text messages from her husband, and the official story of his drunk driving death began to crumble under new review. Roy Harper's coerced statement made the early newspapers only as a footnote, but for Daniel it became the center of everything. Not absolution. Never that. Roy had still been Roy. He had still terrified his family. Still drowned tenderness in alcohol and temper. Still left too many wounds in the people closest to him. But the clean simplicity of despising him was gone now, replaced by something harder to carry. A man can be weak and still be hunted. He can love badly and still try, in one broken corner of himself, to shield his children. Daniel did not know what to do with that, except live near it. One evening near the end of March, he He drove back to Maple Ridge for the first time, without a lawyer or an agent or a trunk full of copied records. The town looked both the same and not. The diner still served meatloaf on Thursdays. The courthouse still stood on Main Street, with its old stone face. But there were state seals on 2 office doors, reporters still lingering near the steps, and people who had once waved at him from across the street, now choosing whether to do it based on who else was watching. He parked outside the cemetery before sunset and walked to his father's grave carrying no flowers, because that would have felt dishonest. The stone was plain. Roy Allen Harper. Beloved father, husband. Daniel had always thought the beloved part was aspirational at best. He stood there with his hands in his jacket and let the silence settle. "You should have told us," he said finally. Wind moved through the cedar trees. A truck on the highway downshifted in the distance. "You should have told Mom. You should have told me. You should have told Maggie. You don't get points for bleeding alone if all it does is teach everybody else to do the same thing." He looked down at the stone and felt anger rise, then bend around grief, then tire itself out before becoming either. "But I know why you thought it might work," he said. "That's the part I hate." The sky went orange behind the tree line. Daniel stood there until the light thinned and the words inside him ran out. Not resolved, not forgiven, just said. When he got back to the truck, Maggie was sitting on the hood with 2 coffees from the gas station across the road. She had not asked if he wanted company. She rarely did anymore when it mattered most. "Mom said I should check whether you'd join the dead out of stubbornness," she said as he approached. Daniel took 1 cup. She always was optimistic. Maggie looked toward the cemetery gate. "You talked to him?" "A little." "Did he apologize?" Daniel gave a tired half-smile. "Not great at follow-through. Still." Maggie nodded, as if that tracked. They stood there together, while twilight pulled the color out of everything. "I got an offer from the State Records Task Force," she said after a while. Daniel turned. "For real?" "Temporary. Maybe permanent if I don't offend too many important men. That ship probably sailed." "Probably." She sipped her coffee. "It means leaving town at least during the week." "You should." She looked at him. "What about you?" Daniel stared at Main Street below them, at the courthouse where the first door had opened, at the little grid of streets that had made him, and trapped him, and, in some crooked way, taught him the exact vocabulary of what he could not keep tolerating. "I don't know yet," he said. "Mom wants to come home once her hand gets stronger. Then we figure out ramps and railings and med schedules and all the boring heroic stuff." "Yeah." Maggie's face softened. "You can stay, you know. And it wouldn't count as getting stuck this time." Daniel. Let that sit. The old version of him would have heard accusation in it. The newer one, bruised into slightly better hearing, recognized the offer instead. Not redemption. Just participation. Family as work, not sentiment. "Maybe," he said. Down on Main Street, the courthouse clock struck 7. In the fading light, it sounded older than the town itself, like something patient enough to survive scandal. Sermons, arrests, and names changing on office doors. Maple Ridge would keep going. Some of the harm would be repaired. Some wouldn't. Some people would tell the story as a triumph of truth. Others would call it a tragedy of local collapse. Most would do what people always did, which was wake up and make breakfast and carry yesterday inside today without ever fully naming the weight. Daniel sipped the bitter gas station coffee and looked out over the town he had nearly fled 100 times and finally, accidentally, helped expose. Nothing in him felt peaceful. His father was still dead. Eddie Raines was still dead. Pike was in critical condition under guard. Calder was in a county jail 3 hours away, waiting for the full architecture of his life to be described in charges. Their mother would come home weaker than before. Maggie would leave and stay and leave again in the complicated rhythm of daughters who refused to disappear. None of it was clean. None of it made a lesson simple enough to print on a courthouse banner. But for the first time in Daniel's life, the fear in his chest did not feel like an inheritance. It felt like something he had looked at directly and chosen not to hand down untouched. He stood with his sister beside the truck while darkness finally took the road, and together they watched the town keep breathing.